my name is Paul Vanderklay, and I'm a pastor at Livingstone's Christian Reformed Church. I have a YouTube channel. I started a local meetup to discuss the work of Jordan Peterson a couple of years ago. And even though we don't talk about Jordan Peterson much because he hasn't done much, that's where I met Raj. And we just talk about a lot of interesting ideas when we get together. And Raj told me he was doing a podcast with a friend, Ethan, I'd never met before. So I asked if I'd be willing to go on it. Said, sure. Give them a chance to get their podcast up and running. So here I am. Not sure what we'll talk about today, but all my conversations with Raj are very, very interesting. So I'm sure it'll be great.
I'm looking forward to it. And thanks for giving us this opportunity, Paul. Raj, I'm really interested in religion. I got a BA and an MA in religious studies. I actually just finished up with my thesis, and I was on American civil religion, but I'm a practicing Sikh. I also live in Sacramento. Yeah. Oh, Ethan and I met while in undergrad at Bard College.
I'm Ethan. I live in Brooklyn right now. I work at a brewery. I'm not really too involved. The podcast is really the only thing I'm involved with besides like any sort of political or work like that. I went to Bard and kind of didn't really like it too much. So I took like a little break of dealing with politics and thinking about all this stuff to like kind of reflect, step back. And then me and Raj were always interested in just talking about the general political climate. So we decided to come back and do this podcast. And I had never heard of you, Paul, before Raj mentioned you. So I've watched some of your videos, done some research. So hopefully we'll have some good things to talk about.
Cool.
So Ethan and I are both pretty interested in the rise of wokeism, woke ideology. We saw it firsthand while we were at Bard. And I know that you're pretty aware of what's going on with that, Paul. I was very interested in this idea that you see wokeism kind of as a Christian heresy, along with the heresy of kind of prosperity gospel on the other side of the political spectrum. And I guess the question is how does one deal with a heresy, and where do we sort of because I think that this is something we can get into maybe a little bit later on in the conversation, but it seems to me that one of the aspects of the heresy is this focus on God 2 at the expense of God 1. But
yeah, could you so I'm not really too into the religious stuff. Could you maybe define the God 1 and 2 thing and what you mean by heresy real quick?
Those are two excellent questions. So heresy is a word that there's orthodox, which is straight, orthodontist makes your teeth straight. Heterodox means it's going in all different directions. And so what to me a heresy is, at least within the Christian sphere, is an idea that comes out of the church somewhere. So it's an idea that is sort of birthed within the community, but it brings the community in a different direction and finally in a self-destructive direction. It's a heresy is, and I get this from a book by Alistair McGrath, who is an English scholar, wrote a little book on heresy. And it's basically an idea that will eventually lead to the dissolution of the community and the coherence of the belief framework. That's, in my opinion, what a heresy is. Orthodoxy is straight, and so orthodox beliefs help a community to continue the thread of the religion, because I mean everything as you go through time.
Heresy is almost like straying from the righteous path in a way. It's a bad turn.
It's a bad turn, and obviously it's a value judgment. You don't know in the moment if an idea is going to lead you astray or not. It's usually only within, especially in something like a religious community, large amounts of time whereby it eventually becomes obvious that this idea was a bad choice, even if it was made centuries before. And so at some point, then there's a correction. Usually in a religious community, there's a body of beliefs, there's a certain authority structure. And if an idea is found outside of that body of beliefs or a competing body of beliefs, there'll be tension and people work it through. Some people say this is the orthodox belief, other people say that's the orthodox belief. But over time, usually it's sort of a Darwinian approach to communities and thought and ideas. So
Right.
a heresy is something.
Oh, sorry. It's like a
Okay.
maladaptive turn for the tradition.
Right. And
Okay.
and it will eventually mean the destruction of the tradition and especially the community, which is holding the tradition.
Right.
So that's a heresy. Now, my God 1 and God 2 nomenclature I developed in watching Jordan Peterson talk to Sam Harris, because at the end of their first conversation, it became clear they had two different definitions of what each meant by God. And Jordan Peterson had an idea which I think was far older. And as I've continued to study and ruminate on these things, far more in keeping with the Hebraic tradition that God is, well, the easiest way for me to split it was to take at least for Christians, was to take a passage out of the book of Isaiah, where Isaiah goes into the temple and there's these angels there, and they cry out, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory." So holy, holy, holy in Hebrew is this idea that God is different, set apart. He's distinct from the world. The whole earth is full of his glory means that God is everywhere present. His fingerprints are all over the world. So pantheism would be an idea of God and the world are essentially a closed set. So that would be an immanent God. A transcendent God is separate from the world. Now, there was a Hebrew scholar in the 1930s who wrote a very interesting book comparing the Hebrew conception of God in the Bible as opposed to surrounding conceptions in mythologies of the other ancient Near East cultures. And he came up with the idea that most cultures have what he called a meta-divine realm, in which there's basically an impersonal arena in which various gods are agents within that arena, as are human beings, as might be sun, moon, and stars. All of these are agents within the arena. Sam Harris's God number 2 is sort of an agent within the arena. Jordan Peterson's God number 1 is sort of the arena itself that can have an agentic power sometimes. So when I thought about what happened in terms of Christian history, especially when we get to deism, the development of deism, whereas before, if there's a tsunami or an earthquake, well, that was God doing that, and it was God's judgment on the people. Well, once you have this idea of deism, which arrives at this idea of nature as this independent thing from God, well, now when there's a tsunami, well, it's nobody's fault. That's just what nature does. And nature is this thing that runs on its own. And then you had, at least in Christian circles, the idea of a clockmaker God who kind of winds up the universe and lets it go, and things happen on their own. And I think over time, what very much happened was God increasingly became a figure in the system, but the universe itself was impersonal. And so that was sort of a loss of this original Hebrew conception, which was everything sort of in one package. All right. And so that's where you get this distinction, God number 1 and God number 2. That's summarizing hours and hours and hours of talk.
Yeah.
Maybe it'll give you
that
a
makes sense to
little
me.
taste of it.
I'll try to approach it a little bit from a Sikh angle, if you don't mind. There's a passage that's part of the daily liturgy, which goes, "You have 1,000 eyes, yet without eye are you. You have 1,000 faces, yet without face are you. You have 1,000 feet, yet without foot are you. You have 1,000 scents, yet without scent are you. I am enchanted by your wonders. There is a light in all, and that light is you. By that light we are illuminated. And there's this distinct, I think maybe a elementary way to think about God number two is this phrase of Mr. God. That might be a little reductionist, but it seems that Mr. God is the person who's going to help you, right? It's God kind of like as a superhero. And I'm not saying that in Sikhi, just like in Christianity, God number one and God number two are the same thing. God does manifest in this personal way as Mr. God. But I think one of the things that we're seeing right now, and it's a consequence of things that happened a long time ago, like you're laying out, Paul, that people have sort of developed this idolatrous relationship with God number two at the expense of God number one. And for the left, especially the woke left, God number two is being manifested as the state. And for the prosperity gospel sort of Christian fundamentalist evangelical branch, I don't know exactly how you would label it, but that idolatrous God number two relationship on the right side of the political spectrum kind of makes an idol out of Jesus. I don't want to say that in I hope that doesn't make too many of your listeners upset, but it's this idea that Jesus is going to make sure you get like a nice car, or Jesus is going to help you out financially. And it's a very, it's an ends-based relationship. You're not in the relationship with Jesus necessarily for the sake of being in the relationship, that you're going to get some good out of it. And I think that if you do not if you're not oriented with God number one properly, God number two cannot save you. God number two saves people in a personal way. God number two does not save the world. That's the responsibility of the believers to stay in alignment with God number one. And so in Sikhism, there's a couple of things where like God does manifest as a person. There's a quick line. So I actually, I'm no expert in Sikhism. I'm just someone trying to learn about it and live it properly. But I actually found a new section of the holy book, the Guru Granth Sahib, that I was ignorant of. And it's a section where some disciples are praising the gurus. And they say, Kapila and the other yogis sing of Guru Nanak. He is the avatar, the incarnation of the infinite Lord. So it is this notion of God taking flesh into the world. But Guru Nanak goes around and he saves individual people, and then he keeps reincarnating 10 different times. But the really kind of interesting thing is that by the 10th incarnation, Guru Gobind Singh, he says something along the lines of, those who call me God will fall into the pit of hell. Regard me as a humble servant of the Lord and have no doubt about it. So here's God manifesting as a person, and he tells people, do not think I am God. Even though in other places it says, I am God. And it's contradictory, but it's this sort of warning to not make an idol out of the flesh version of God, because God is reality itself. I like it, to put it like how Vervaeke would talk about it. Like reality and God are the same thing, at least as far as I can make sense of it.
Well, that would be, so part of what's difficult in these conversations is, so a question would be, is God exhausted by the thing we call reality? And in Christianity, God would not be exhausted by the thing we call reality, because God is in fact the source of that thing we call reality. And in a contemporary way, it's been interesting to watch the simulation theories arise and people's interest in those, because again, now suddenly when you have the picture of a programmer coding a program in which we are all programs within that program. Now, suddenly you get a conception of God, and some of those relationships with that God can sort of manifest in there.
Right.
And so one of the things that we struggle with is so the holy idea in Christianity is that God is, in Judaism, is that God is beyond our conception. This is not something we are able to conceive of. Yet, then how can God relate to us? And so Christianity, obviously, with Jesus Christ, God writes himself into the story in the incarnation.
Right.
And
so I have a question for you guys, if you don't mind me cutting in. Who do you think, or what do you think the whether you call it woke ideology or identity people, anti-racist, maybe, what do you think they conceive of as God? What is their God to them? And it kind of reminded me when you said not able to conceive of, kind of this idea that people of different races or genders or sexualities have separate experiences. And so this there's been a meme we talked about before in our last episode, or maybe the first one, about I will never understand, but I'll stand with you. And that it kind of reminds me of this idea in religion where you can't actually understand or conceive of God or his will or knowledge. You sort of have to take it upon faith. But then I don't know if I could answer that question, like what they would see as God, or if they have a God that they look up to.
A lot depends on how you're using that. See, God is this astoundingly useful idea and word that is just all over the place. Mm-hmm. One of the things that's incredibly important to remember about woke ideology is that it's a deeply secular movement. And what that means is, whereas, let's say, in the 19th century and in many different Christian traditions, people would be anticipating a life in a world to come, an afterlife, and so then eternal judgment, happens in the afterlife. Eternal reward happens in the afterlife. The best that I can understand is evil in the better question might be, what is evil in woke religion? And evil is an experience of oppression, or I would think actually more of a failure to realize a desire. And when I say realize a desire, I mean a failure to fully live into a desire. Okay, so it's and because it's a secularized thing, that desire, at least for you as an individual, someone whose identity is based on your oppression, that that must happen within your life. Now, I think there's another aspect of it which you can find, let's say, in John Lennon's song, where this desire must somehow happen in human behavior or a human future. And so ideas such as, an asteroid hitting the world or nuclear annihilation, I mean, all of those are threats as well. But it's the epistemology of wokeism, it's you sort of have a Cartesian epistemology where I am oppressed, therefore I am. And salvation is release from that oppression. And now full salvation would be everyone's release from their oppression. The difficulty, of course, is that once you start working in these terms, there's going to be an oppressor. Well, what does the oppressor need? Well, the oppressor is oppressed as well. Okay. But maybe the desire of that oppressor is to oppress. Maybe that's their fulfillment. What do you do with that? No. And so then very quickly you're going to have something more objective come in and say no. And so all of these rules are going to then line up that this is oppression and this is not oppression. Whiteness is bad, blackness is good. And what happens is people begin at this little kernel, and you're very quickly going to manifest a legal framework, an objective, because a system simply can't do without it if it's got multiple people. So
it seems also, I think, like, it's obviously a secular movement, but there's been discussion. People like John McWhorter have talked about it. I saw Coleman Hughes mention it recently. I've seen Ross how do you say his name? Douthit. Talk about this recently, that it's taken on religious tones. And so it's not like typical, they're not going to church and praying necessarily, but the way that they're reasoning is reminiscent of religion, and sort of like a passionate, almost like a fire and brimstone sort of preaching. And I think it's interesting you bring up like evil, because it does seem that they're focused more on defeating evil than praising good. And that does seem to lead to quite a few problems. And it seems like it's hard to create or sustain a movement or create anything worthwhile if you're so focused on negation. And Raj, you might want to chime in here. We've talked about this idea of Nietzsche and decadence and ressentiment. And it seems that plays a role in this desire to negate, that people are resenting good and they're inverting values in a certain sort of sense.
There's what's his name, Herman Cain. We in our first episode we talked to DeRoy Murdoch, and he mentioned this quote by Herman Cain where he's basically saying that for some reason the woke left, they aren't going towards the future. I think this is related towards the negation rather than trying to create something positive. And I don't mean positive as in good, but positive as in creating something rather than getting rid of something. And Herman Cain says that there's this focus on fixing the past rather than building a better future. And I think both of these, this question of being hyper-focused on evil, it's a related sort of phenomenon where you got to fix things, but the fixing is about changing interpretations or changing the understanding of other people in the past rather than an individual or the group of people being better and going into the future together.
I think that's very true. I think it's one of its huge weaknesses is it's fundamentally a reactive movement, in that if you no longer had the enemy,
right,
what are you going to do now?
So this is this is something that Ethan and I noticed while we were at Bard. So Bard sort of touts itself for being one of the first colleges to offer a degree in human rights. It sounds really good, really well intentioned and all that, right? There's probably some worthwhile effort in studying what human rights are. But what we were noticing, especially in the way that administrators worked on campus, was it seems to, if all of a sudden you have a degree for human rights and your job is going to be fixing human rights abuses, you're going to be looking for human rights violations everywhere. And your job might actually rely on the fact that you might need to manufacture some human rights problems.
Or just label regular old problems as a human rights issue. So
right.
You're kind of raising the level of conversation. You're always in DEFCON red. And so it can't just be that, there's some unthoughtful students on campus who aren't being kind to their other students. There's human rights violations going on. And even, I don't think the human rights thing might not be necessary, but just some sort of, if you're in a gender and sexualities class where you're constantly learning about how institutions are sexist and it's bad to read too many old white men and all of your professors are white men, you're going to start to think, oh my God, I'm in a sexist system. I got to do something about this.
Right. And that, yeah. Sorry.
Well, I agree. And it's remarkably difficult. So C.S. Lewis was a teacher, was a professor of medieval English at Magdalen College in the UK in the middle of the 20th century. He wrote these Narnia Chronicles, and commenters have noted that it's relatively easy to write an engaging fictional negative hero or villain. Villains are fairly easy to represent. They're fun to play for actors. It's really difficult to write compelling good people. Goodness is remarkably, G.K. Chesterton made a similar observation. most of the moral insights we are able to generate are responsive to what we see as evil. Evil's fairly easy to identify. Something that is good in and of itself is much, much more difficult. And this gets into, you know, the Orwellian response to, you know, Stalin, which is, in order to make an omelet, you have to break some eggs. And George Orwell's response was, "Where's the omelet?" And that's a vigorous, you know, Douglas Murray, I'll give credit to him for remembering this. That's a really, you know, and I've seen this for years. So I grew up in what was in the 60s and 70s a racial reconciliation church that my father was pastoring, where the idea was, can white folks and black folks worship together? And so most of the people in the church I grew up in were black. It was in a poor community. And this was the project. It was a project I would call second wave anti-racism, where the focus was on integration, living together, you know, a communal life across racial and cultural lines. And that's the setting in which I grew up. And it was a wonderful time and place in many ways to grow up. And then I watched the social justice conversation continue. And at some point I began asking people, show me a fully developed community. Because you had poor communities in which it was fairly obvious that, well, the manifestations of poverty and violations of human rights were fairly easy to see. Okay, now let's go off into a suburban community that is full of resources and all of those things. Well, right away you begin pointing fingers. Well, these people are, you know, parasitic of the deficiencies here. So it's like, well, show me the kind of community you want people to live in.
Yeah, we just did our last episode on Chaz Chop, and the type of community that they want to live in does not work out very well.
Right.
It's
they kind of, it seems like if, I think the modern day, if you call them social justice warriors, woke ideology, proselytizers, etc., they want to live in like a gentrified neighborhood of Brooklyn, essentially. But at the same time, that's their worst nightmare. Like if you gave them a choice of where to live, they want to live in a metro area close to a city center in an old building that was refurbished and has, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And they want authentic local or authentic international cuisine. They don't want, you know, they have various lists of demands and things they want, but it's also literally impossible to imagine because once they've created that, like basically like the area I live in, Brooklyn, they're still unhappy. They're actually even more unhappy because they've become the gentrifiers. And all the, I don't know, there's almost sort of like a voyeuristic or fetishization of poor culture, or especially minorities. And so like they really want to live near black people, but it seems more because they want to be seen as anti-racist. And they're not moving to Harlem or to the Bronx as much as they're moving to Williamsburg. So I don't know, I think there's something to be said there.
This is an old thing. I remember when I was in college, that was during the Sandinista thing, and I was going down to Nicaragua to tour the revolution.
Oh, I've been to Nicaragua.
I remember one woman coming down with us. She was a student. She's like, "We're going to see the poor," and I thought, don't have to go to Nicaragua to see the poor. I grew up on, there's poor people all over the place. I mean, and they have this, it's a fetishization, it's a romanticism, and so now you've got this. So I grew up again in the 60s and 70s, and I watched, you know, the white flight, people leaving the cities because of riots and protests. And then in the 90s with Friends and Seinfeld and Sex and the City, they all came back to the city, and now gentrification. Well, just wait, it's going to be, now white flight. I mean, it's sort of, there's a strange combination of self-righteousness and deep moral insecurity, you know, as someone like, you know, Shelby Steele calls white guilt. And these things come together. Whereas if you look at the history of religious communities, and this is deep in American history, there have been many communities that have had deeply concerted efforts to try to realize one way or another the omelet in our midst. And this has been basically the project of religious communities for a very long time, especially since in Christianity, since the Protestant Reformation. And in many ways, I see these current movements as heirs of New England transcendentalism. If you look at the history of the American Northeast, the Pilgrims, the Puritans, I mean, it's all a continuation of the same story.
We where we went to college, Bard, it's actually probably on the southernmost tip of the burnt over area. And it's funny. It's like this new version of this same utopian project is showing up again.
That's right.
Yeah, it reminds me of well, one thing I had the very similar thing that I was talking to a girl in a bar, and we were talking about where we would travel if we could. And I mentioned that I wanted to go to India, maybe with Rajdeep, to visit our friend Amr, who was living there until recently. And I said like, oh, he's got like a fairly nice place, and we have another friend who's like fairly wealthy. And she said, well, don't you want to see real India, like the poverty? I was like, well, not particularly on my vacation. Like if I'm going to go do volunteer work, to help someone, or if I really want to see poverty, I could go to Baltimore, Detroit, or Orlando, Miami, Los Angeles, the Bronx. So I just thought that was really funny. But with this kind of white flight and rebound thing, there's a song, Love Me, I'm a Liberal by Phil Oakes. And it's funny how it's exactly relevant today, where he says like, I want colored people to be free and wealthy. I just don't want them to live next door. Something to that effect. And it's I think you could change the lyrics ever so slightly, and it would very accurately depict what's going on now. What is it, 60 years later since he wrote that?
Yeah. These things, it's not new. They're new aspects and manifestations, and it's obviously new to a lot of people.
It's more sophisticated, I think, too. Like the rhetoric in the language has acquired a very academic nature to it. So like white privilege, institutionalized racism, heteronormativity, these words have kind of become more developed and powerful, even though the impulse was always there, I think.
Yeah. And it's, I had a conversation with the guy who was what do you call it, gender anarchist, and it's you just start following some of these things down, and you can deconstruct forever.
Right.
Part of, again, I think a key to this is you will land finally on, well, if I am my oppression and what I seek is liberation, when will that liberation just simply be realized to be the manifestation of my own desire? Well, that's not terribly easy to always know either. Just really pin someone down and say, what do you want? And suddenly, this gets into some of the Vervaeke stuff. Now suddenly you're going to have a meaning crisis, because what am I? Am I simply a manifestations of my biological desires, or the constructed desires of my history, and the history that tracks down? I mean, pretty soon I am nothing. I am just a desire. And
or if
get into these deep questions of identity.
If your purpose is to be anti-racist, that is just a negation. You can't go very far with that. And I saw this when I went to college. I went to a large public high school. Wasn't the best school in the world, so we didn't get exposed to very much philosophy or like deeper stuff. So I started learning more about this, and I initially thought, wow, a lot of these students are so smart, brilliant. They went to all these private schools. And then when you start to investigate deeper, it seems almost very shallow, and they don't actually have very many firm beliefs. One thing I actually wrote down in my notes, I don't know if maybe Raj, don't want to move on or want to keep talking, but I remember when I was a kid and growing up, we weren't very religious. We went to church when I was younger. My mother grew up Catholic, but my parents talked about the idea of a conscience very much. And when I got to college, I don't think I ever heard that word used. Despite all this talk about morality, good, bad, I was thinking about it, and I was like, I don't think I've ever heard anyone use that word. And it's more just about like, sort of, what are you? Who do you believe? What do you believe in? Are you just a mass of cells whose goal is to be anti-racist? Well, what do you do when, I guess anti-racism is never over if you believe certain people, but I don't know, it just seems to inevitably lead to a crisis of meaning if your goal is to be anti something.
I think that's also like America is facing a lot of political problems right now, but I think the deeper issue is this meaning crisis, and there's this vacuum for this religious, spiritual fulfillment, and people are turning to politics for that fulfillment. In the Chaz Chop situation, there was a woman who gave a speech, and she said, "So when you come into this space, understand that you are now walking in holy land. This is spiritual." And it's like, oh, whoa. And this is also a woman who says later on, there's you can find the article, it's on the Seattle Times, but she also talks about how it's a place where white people need to get educated, and she doesn't feel comfortable there in her black body. And it's like, whoa, these are the incongruency between this being a holy spiritual space and you saying like it's this really profane space that's full of sin. It's like it's the contradictions inside of this ideology are just, it's manifold, and it's really concerning because it's not healthy for people. We saw lots of people at school, and it seemed like their mental health deteriorated over the course of their time at college.
Yeah.
And it's
Sharply.
Yeah, and it's really concerning, not just for what it's bringing about politically, but the damage it's doing to people's individual lives, and it's setting family members against each other. People can't.
Personally, since
Huh?
I was going to say, personally, since leaving college, I've noticed being happier and less stressed just by not being in this sort of environment immediately, like night
Right.
and day over a course of a couple months.
Right, and now it's like I'm mostly around apolitical people, and life's never really been better.
Yeah, when you go to, like, I'm not going to say I haven't had political discussions at bars and whatnot. A lot of people don't want to talk about politics. But now recently that sort of shifted. But the last couple of years, I've mostly, me and my friends just kind of bullshit and talk about nonsense a lot of times, make fun of each other. And I like talking about politics, but it does sort of make it, life has been a lot more fun since I wasn't around a lot of these woke people or social justice warriors.
This hunger too, I think that the spiritual hunger, I think it's a hunger for God one. And people aren't understanding that. Like this new age stuff that we see, that's all people wanting to get in touch with God one, this idea of oneness. Even the atheists who are turning to Buddhism, they're trying to find God one through negation of everything. And it's, I think that's something that needs to desperately be recovered. And I think that's it's kind of the guru's mission in Sikhism. He just kind of comes around and keeps whacking people on the head saying, don't forget God one, don't forget God one. And like you see this even in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? God is saying, when Abraham is trying to make the deal with God, trying to save Sodom, and he's negotiating how many people need to be able to, if there are 50 righteous people in the city, will you save it or whatever? And he kind of keeps negotiating the price down all the way down to, I think, 10 people or something like that. And it's like, if you have 10 people who understand God one and are living in congruence with God one, then God two can come save. But if only one person understands God one, God two will come save that person and his family, but the rest of the city will burn to the ground. And I think that's kind of what we saw in communists in the Soviet Union and in Nazi Germany. Obviously, there's extenuating material factors into how things actually play out in each situation, but I think that that's this sort of simplistic religious answer to the question. Because I got interested kind of in post-Holocaust theology for a long time, and it's like how could God let this happen? How could God let this happen? And Elie Wiesel, I think he has this play about putting God on trial, not necessarily for the Holocaust, but for something that happened, I think in the late 1600s. And I believe the play ends with the jury finding God guilty, and then they all pray. Like that's the end of the story. God is guilty of the crime, the way that you can judge God in a criminal court, that version of God is found guilty. But the solution to the problem is everyone starts praying.
It's interesting. I've read Subway Salad, but I haven't read all of him.
I think there's you mind if we talk about Kanye for a second?
No, you talk about anything. You guys talk about anything you want.
So Raj, I wanted to ask you one quick question, or
Yeah.
Paul, if you want to chime in, but I definitely want to talk about Kanye in a minute. Just to go back to this God as the solution or problem, the way my opinion would be that community, in terms of having friends, family, a place in the community, maybe you see your friend every day and you wave to him, or maybe you always go to the same deli and you see the same guy, that sort of local being in harmony with your other fellow people. I think to me that's the solution rather than God, just personally.
That's
so
church.
If you see people who are, I guess you could say church, but
or the
even going to the
satsang
park.
in Sikhism, like it's being in the presence of people who are sort of working on this project of going into a positive direction. That's what the Satsangat is, the true congregation, company of the holy. And the Guru says when he, the last Guru, he says that I am the Bani, which is the word, it's the scripture, but I am also the Khalsa, which is the body of initiated Sikhs, the baptized body. He says, I am now, like, this is my form as a body. My form is also as scripture, but my form is also the community. Like when God too manifests himself, it manifests on these three levels of a sort of text, a person, and the community through which you're trying to realize the vision of what it means to live in accordance with God one. I don't know if Paul probably knows a lot more about community, being a pastor and all that.
Community's hard. And the, it's always, the truth is we're all participating in various communities at the same time. We have a little community of 3 right now. If you have a marriage or a significant other, you have a community of 2. If you have biological children, in my case, I have 5, a community of 7. Have a local congregation, that's a community of 50, 75. The Christian Reformed community, that's a community of about 250,000. But right away, you begin to say, well, the community of within a marriage, the community within a family, these are they all have different levels, and they also have different orientations. You might have a group of friends that you play World of Warcraft together, and there's a community. And so then very quickly what you become is this hub in a network of communities. And you're exactly right that for human beings, I mean, we're deeply communal creatures. We are made for each other, and a lot of happiness studies come out with the most obvious answer, which is that people are most happy when they are in community. But that, is what is that community around? I heard once that the German people were never happiest as they were under, at least before the war started taking its toll in Nazi Germany, but they suddenly, as a community, they were around an ideal. And it's very interesting, and I think this is part of the reason that right now wokeism is so strong, because whoosh, here is a moral center for our community. And what is better than to be against oppression or racism or injustice? And you can very quickly develop a community that way. A mob is a community of sorts. And part of the reason people do what they would never do individually is they manifest, in a sense, the principality or the spirit of that community. So it's vital, but tricky.
I think in a certain way, though, to become a mob, when you become a mob, you sort of abandon all of your other communities. And so you shut off your other ties to your fellow people, and you then completely become absorbed in that. Maybe community's too amorphous of a term, I think, but I think more like what I guess I mean more specifically is kind of like positive social bonds between people. So you might have these a community in Germany during early Nazi era where they're happy, but I think there might be something, they feel happy, but they don't actually have true social connections so much as there's been an enforced ideology that makes them behave in a homogenous way, which reduces conflict maybe. But that's also very much what the woke ideology is kind of pushing, which is enforced conformity in order to lessen negative feelings.
Yeah,
maybe
the Chaz Chop people, right? During the day, at the beginning of their experiment, they loved it. They thought it was the greatest thing, and it had this feeling of being like an art fair. It had this feeling of like there's these hippie vibes going on, and it seemed like a really great place at the beginning, but it very quickly crashed and burned. But I think that's sort of like this idea of what are you looking up to, or what's in the center. That's the thing that you have to circumambulate. And if you have this principality that is not the most high, it's gonna fall apart. Like the positive social bonds happen because you're actually oriented toward the right thing, something like truth or something like love, if you want to use virtue terms. And if the community looks up and what they see is, if they look up the hierarchy and what they see is oppression, or what they look to in the center and what they see is oppression and excluding, you're not going to be able to go up and down, and you're not going to be able to go round and round.
What if they look up to Kanye West?
Well, Kanye's not. Some people might say that Kanye's looking to himself as the Most High, but I don't think that is the case. I know that you and Peugeot talked a little, or you made some videos about Peugeot's take on Kanye, Paul, and I was just curious if you've listened to the song "Wash Us in the Blood." That is his most recent release.
No, I haven't heard that one yet.
Okay, so pretty close to the beginning. This goes into your conversation about mooks and knights. The lyrics are, "Is there anybody here? Is there anybody here that can save no matter how much you play or hate? It was the blood that cleansed me." And so Kanye's aware of these things. I don't know how much in a rational sense he's aware of these things going on, but he's definitely intuitively aware of these dynamics, and he's trying to he's doing something different. I don't know if you guys saw any of the footage from his recent rally. It's gotten a lot of heat, especially from people on the left, and they can't understand what he's doing, especially when he starts talking about religion. They just think that he's talking nonsense. Like when he kind of makes this parallel between him and Moses, they're like, how, like the ego on this guy, but it's like, Dr. King did something similar. They, you know, they think of his, so he cries, he kind of cries, and he has this outburst of emotion, and people take it as this manifestation of his mental illness. But he's crying over the fact that he was almost aborted, and he had asked Kim to abort their daughter. And it's like, I totally understand why you would cry about that. And one of the he's doing these things that are very unpolitician-like, and we've all been complaining about how politicians have been operating recently, and one of them is like they're divorced from reality. And it's like, here's a very real problem that lots of people face in our country, right? This question of how to interact with abortion. And he gives his sort of he recounts his experience, and then he doesn't think abortion is something that you should do, but he also goes on to say in the same conversation or same rally that he doesn't think it should be outlawed. He actually calls up a woman from the crowd to come onto the stage or come to the front, and she gives her viewpoint on why she thinks that abortion should stay legal, and he gives the space to someone in the crowd to speak to him. I don't think Donald Trump or Joe Biden would do that, nor would they they wouldn't do it in the organic way. This didn't seem like some sort of plant, right? If Trump or Biden were to do that, it would be much more planned out. And he gives her space to talk, and he says something along the lines of abortion should not be illegalized. But this is the thing that really piqued my interest. He said we should give we should give people who have a baby $50,000, maybe $1 million, right? And it sounds crazy, but he is trying to. I think one of the biggest problems our country has is that we incentivize single parent households, and he's trying to look for a solution to that problem. And I don't know how you solve that problem. How do you start incentivizing 2-parent households? But that seems to be, this is something that lots of Black Republicans picked up on. I recently watched Larry Elder's documentary, Uncle Tom. And what so many Black Republicans are talking about is that our communities are failing because 75% of our kids are growing up in single parent homes. That's tragedy. That's not a good thing. I like single moms. I know that they've got their work cut out for them. A lot of them try really hard. I also know some of them don't. Like if you've got to work a job, maybe 2 jobs, and you're trying to raise children, I don't know how you can do that. And I don't have kids, but that seems almost like an impossible task.
Oh, and one, so we can say, oh, what's with that? How should children be raised? Well, first of all, normally, biologically, you're not going to have a child by yourself. I can't just decide, I'm going to have a baby. Right. No, I'm going to have to partner with a woman to do this. Can you, and I think this gets into Kanye, can you sustain a relationship? Can you sustain a healthy little community? That's remarkably difficult. And it very quickly gets into the question of these desires, because, it's not, if you're a person with a sex drive, it's not, and if you're a person with a heterosexual sex drive, and you're young, odds are, if everything's working, a child very well may come out of this. Okay. What do children need? Children need stability. They need reliability. Are you going to be there for me? And be there for me in just about every spectrum. Be there for me financially. Be there for me emotionally. And then, from 1 to 6, it's 0 to 6, it's Lord, be there for me, giving me everything I need. 6 on up, it's more be there for me, but giving the right kind of support, and also push back and train and say no. I mean, it's an enormously complex thing. Kanye is sort of this, if you had an amplifier and a speaker and you could plug it into something that was a creature of sort of pure intuition.
Right.
Listening to Kanye is like the raw feed of intuition. He's over here, he's over there, he's over here, he's over there. He was running for president, and then he hired a guy and that guy, of course, was diligently trying to get Kanye onto ballots. And then Kanye just said, nah, we're not going to, I'm going to run for president, but we're not going to worry about any of that balloting, voting thing. Right. Okay. So run for president. And this then gets into the question in American context. And Trump, of course, was sort of a liminal figure in this, because was Trump really serious about running for president? Was it a lark? I mean, was he an accidental winner? And now, even that he's as president, he says these crazy things about, I'm going to order all the churches open. And people are like, well, there's this little thing called the law. This isn't a power you possess, but in Trump's mind, he does. But does he or doesn't he? And so Kanye is sort of like an extreme version of Trump in some ways, slaying aside the whole political questions. But Kanye is in many ways, if there are many, many people out there like Kanye, I meet them every day, who have all kinds of ideas about everything. Why don't we listen to them? Well, Kanye also has, and nobody just gave Kanye didn't inherit all of this wealth. A lot of this wealth he developed. He's a very talented musician, and music is a form in which his intuition plays well. And in some ways, I think part of the reason Kanye has the attention is because he has lived, at least for some communities, the Black American dream. You know, if you go to my channel, you can find the Freddie and Paul show on my channel. That's actually where I started on YouTube. Freddie is a member of my church, and Freddie is a rapper. Freddie's white. He was baptized in this church, a son of two white parents who don't rap at all, but where Freddie went to high school, so on and so forth. So if you listen to Freddie and you listen to Kanye, well, there's some connection between the two of them. Kanye was a success, went all the way to the top and realized, for a while, he had a relationship with a porn star for a while, wasn't that thing? I mean, it was like the life of a rapper, but he didn't grow up in the hood. His mother was an academic. And so he's in some ways managed to bridge both the Black ghetto thug's life and the university academic life. And now he's sort of going into the political sphere. And of course, he married the queen of famous for being famous, and now wealthy for being famous. I mean, in many ways, Kanye and Kim manifest these aspirational archetypes in our culture. And so president is just in some ways the natural step, just like it was Donald Trump. But this, I think, in some ways is also pushing on. So if you talk to Jonathan Peugeot, he says, well, I'm a monarchist, because in some ways monarchy sort of in Peugeotian language lays itself out naturally. What the United States did was say, no more king, okay? We're going to have, in a sense, a paper king called the Constitution. And the process is going to be nailed down. And so kings are unpredictable. So we're going to have a process. And so we're going to have a president and a Congress and a judiciary. And this is the system. The system is going to be the agent instead of a human agent who is a king. And in some ways, what's happening in American culture, and has been happening for a long time, Obama was a king. He had a royal family. JFK, they called it Camelot. That wasn't an accident. Donald Trump has acted like a king. Kanye, I mean, so this archetype is manifesting itself before our eyes, but it's a very chaotic one. And as Peugeot said, it's sort of the fool or the clown, and he's turning it around.
Eric Weinstein, I don't remember what thing I was watching. He kind of makes this throwaway comment. It might have been on one of his Rogan interviews, this idea of having a fourth branch of the United States government, which is the symbolic. Right. And he's like, that would be, they don't have any real power, but it's someone that people can vote for as the representative of the United States. And it's like, Kim and Kanye, if we had a symbolic branch, they would be, I don't know who would be more appropriate for that position.
Well, but pay attention when you say they don't have any power.
Right. They have this influence over the people's heart.
The question is, what kind of power is that? I mean, earlier in the conversation, you know, you have people, and as a pastor, I often, when people use that word spiritual, I stop them and say, tell me what that means. Because people are like, well, they don't know what it means, but they do know what it means. And so it sort of sloshes around the meaning of it with the word. And, okay, well, the Queen of England, does she have power? She has tremendous power. What kind of power?
The ability to act and have others act with you. That's the Arendtian definition of power. I think it's on revolution. Power is the ability to act and have others act with you. So like having power, institutional power, is not like, you know what I mean? Saying institutional power is not really that informative if you don't understand what power is. If you understand power as acting and others acts with you, then it very clearly becomes like Queen Elizabeth is powerful. Kim Kardashian is powerful. Somebody with 10,000 Twitter followers is a little powerful.
Exactly. And so a symbolic, I mean, what does the Queen of England do? So when there's COVID, she steps out and makes a statement, and everyone's like, well, she fulfilled her role. I mean,
Right.
I watched Netflix The Crown, and I mean, haunting that is, what power do we really have? And, you know, I hear people talking about the glass ceiling, and it's like, did Queen Victoria have power? Queen Victoria had tremendous power. Queen Elizabeth had tremendous power. Cleopatra had tremendous power.
Catherine the Great, Maria Theresa.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to go back a little to this Kanye West thing. So I worked in a flower shop for a while when I first moved to New York City, and it's a very high-end flower shop off of Fifth Avenue. It's out of business now. It folded, but we had some fairly high level clients. And I'm not going to name any names specifically, but actors, people you definitely recognize, hear of, and several people I knew were heavily involved in the event planning wedding industry. So I got a little bit of inside peel behind the curtain of how these crazy, powerful, wealthy celebrities work, actresses, musicians, etc. And a lot of what people believe about them is completely fabricated for the public to consume. So, and it's impossible, I think, for an average person to really know. So when Kanye West goes out and does this thing that appears to be entirely spur of the moment, I think it's actually more likely it's very carefully planned. And especially people like the Kardashians and Kanye West, they've spent years cultivating a very careful image that they feed to people. This might be a little bit cynical, but I think that they plan this. And Kanye West's outbursts and his erraticism, it may be mental illness, which is, I think, more worrying than the lying facade. But I think a lot of it is this lying sort of facade. And I think he acts eccentrically, is that how you say it? Eccentrically, and in order to kind of come across as a little bit more down to earth, like people are more willing to look eye to eye. Oh, you're not actually that powerful and put together. But then also this idea of, like, Raj, you mentioned that he was willing to let this woman come on stage, ostensibly just spur of the moment, and
Right.
Biden or Trump wouldn't do that. If you go back to, like, Paul, I think you were reading about the founding fathers recently. The founding fathers were terrified of a popular leader who would talk directly to the people. It's the demagogue. When they said popular leader, that's equivalent of a demagogue. And that was seen as like a huge danger to our republic and our project as this sort of federalist system, that one person could unify people through speaking directly to them. And I think that this, to be a little bit more cynical, I'll let you talk 1 second, Raj, but to be a little bit more cynical, I think that it's not disconnected that Kanye and Kim got some sort of access in the Trump White House, and they're now running in a way that might enable Trump's victory in a small sense.
I see the danger you're talking about, and Kanye doing that little thing with this woman coming up on stage, I didn't say it was a good thing, but it is something that the populist left and right want. And now that someone did it, they're saying, look how crazy he is. So there's something about I've seen particularly one fella, he has a show called Secular Talk, Kyle Kalinske. He's very much this pro-populist left stance, and now someone did something where he's someone who wants to get rid of the electoral college and have just direct democracy, right? Like the most extreme version of just one vote, one person, one vote. That's how things should be run. I don't agree with that, but this is like Kanye is manifesting this populism that people are crying out for, and then he does it, and people are saying he's crazy. And it's a very odd thing. It's like you recognize that you wanted this. But yeah, I take your the warning about this sort of populism. I agree with you. I mean, the founders were worried about it.
Well, so what is the contrast of populism? Elitism, and these things usually, when why is populism so on the rise now? Because there's a sense in which the elites have not fulfilled their end of the bargain. The bargain of the elite is you have power, you have privilege, you have all of these things, but you do this in terms of serving the masses. And the idea now is that the elites they've made all the money. A lot of the wealth has been generated for them, and many, many people have not. And so now it's time to tear down the elites. But just like with Chaz or Chop, these systems you will create a new system. You can't help it because you rely on these systems. And, it's usually only I often tell people, good administration is invisible. A good administration means I don't have to think about it. And a country that is working fairly well is a country where we don't have to worry about politics because politicians are taking care. The lights are on. There are no invading armies. The systems are working. Someone is keeping the systems going so that I have the liberty to play computer games or watch Netflix, or maybe I'll have to go to work and contribute to the system in some way, but I do have a degree of freedom from the system in order to manifest what I want in terms of what we call my private space. I mean, all of this stuff is produced by our civilization. And this is why I look at a lot of the woke people, and I don't take them terribly seriously, in the sense that I've seen religious people sacrifice and commit themselves in an enduring way in order to achieve a particular goal. That might be a community. They poured money and time into that community. I think a lot of people are just sort of playing at this. If I go out into the street and I put up my fist and I make a sign and I yell magic words, then racism goes away, or doesn't go away, but and I look at this and I think the generation of my parents moved into Paterson, New Jersey, and we built community across racial lines and raised their children there and committed their money there. They gave their life to this vision. That's what religions people do in a serious way. And what I see now are consumers that are sort of playing. They have little electronic avatars, which they imagine themselves to be. It's Animal Crossing. That's the kind of religion they're playing at. And you can see that because of the decline of religious communities.
Well, there's around the corner, I don't know how much it's still going on, but very close to me, there's a park called McCarran Park in Brooklyn. And that's where they had these big vigils for George Floyd constantly. I don't know what the frequency was, but it was at least every night for the first couple of weeks. And then it was on Saturdays, etc. And there's a couple main ways that most people get to it. So you'd see people going with signs and going to meet up, etc. And along one of the main thoroughfares, me and my friends were just walking around the neighborhood, and we're going to this one bar as we pass this one lady all the time who would be kneeling down, a white lady kneeling down with her fist in the air, holding a sign saying something about white silences violence, anti-racism. And I looked at her and I'm like, that she's no different than the guy with the crazy hair standing on the subway platform saying the end is nigh. And anything, that guy, I'd rather talk to that guy because at least he's going to tell me something I haven't heard before, maybe. But she's looking for some kind, if she stays out there too long, she is going to end up, having that sign. But I don't know. It just struck me as like a hilarious moment where this, clearly it seems like college educated upper middle class woman has turned into the street preacher. I almost wanted to take like a pot and put it next to her on the street.
This populism issue and the sort of gulf that's developing between the people on one hand and the elites on the other hand, and it seems that people feel powerless. People feel powerless in their individual lives, and I think that's a big problem, because if you're feeling powerless, then maybe you are powerless, and that means that we have income inequality in the country, but we also have this power inequality. And I just want to read something real quick from The Origins of Totalitarianism. This book has been written against a background of both reckless optimism and reckless despair. It holds that progress and doom are two sides of the same metal, that both are articles of superstition, not of faith. And this, I think it speaks to the powerlessness that post-World War I Germans were feeling, the powerlessness that the serfs were feeling in Russia. And I think that the religious project, in a lot of ways, we talked about Peterson bringing agency into people's lives. And the sort of religious project of what Christ was doing, and what Nanak was doing, what the gurus were doing. These are two traditions I feel most comfortable talking about, because you can correct me on the Christian stuff, Paul. But they kind of do the same thing. They give agency back to the people, or they awaken agency within people. And like Guru Gobind Singh's goal, in one sense, was to put a king in every saddle. And one of the way, it seems that one of the ways to kind of solve this problem of elitism is to actually become an elite a little bit in your own life. Like we talk, bowling alone? People are bowling in leagues less and less, but people are bowling more. People are no longer presidents of things like the Lions Club, right? People aren't in these local positions of power, of these local positions of authority. And so even the degradation of the household is the same thing, right? Tons of people feel powerless over their children. And it's like, what are you talking about? The kid's 4 years old. You're in charge. But I know plenty of parents where the kid is in charge, and it's like, you're powerless over you can't get a 5-year-old to act in accordance with you. And it's like, I don't know. People need to wake up and recognize the power that they have within themselves. And before Kanye sort of did this, released Jesus as king and started doing this more active Christian thing, he had a album called Yeezus. And on that album, he has a song called I Am a God. And people, don't take too kindly to that. But, and it might betray a certain narcissism or arrogance. But he also says that he's a servant of the Most High in that song. He says that he's talking with Jesus. And so it's like, he's not saying that he is God 1 or even God 2, but he is a God, right? He's a principality. And it's like, people need to recognize like their own principality like nature, in a sense. You are most likely going to be you are going to be a servant, but it's like, which king are you going to serve? The king who actually, or it's like a manager, right? Like a good manager delegates tasks and lets people, leaves them to their own devices to fix the problems. And then only if there's something that can't be solved does the manager step in and kind of do things. The manager isn't trying to be like, he's not micromanaging everyone and wanting to actually do everything himself, which seems like how people feel about institutions right now. The institutions are crumbling as people look at them as being these things that are supposed to fix and change everything. We've have less faith in our institutions than ever before, but we keep asking them to do more and more things. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Look, with the Arendt quote, one of her big themes and one of the origins, so to speak, of totalitarianism is rootlessness. Mm-hmm. And especially with the 19th century and the Industrial Revolution, people are suddenly swept away from where they lived for generations and put into cities, and that removes the common bonds and creates an atomized society. And it goes back to this bowling alone idea, and various people have picked up on the death of social life, whatever you want to call it in America. But she hits on this rootlessness thing over and over and over again. And in some way, forming roots seems to be an antidote to totalitarianism. And I think a lot of these people on the woke left, they don't have roots very much, or if they have them, they're ashamed of them because they might be white or their parents might be conservatives, etc. Who knows? And I think maybe, I don't know, I'm not religious at all. I'm an atheist, but I do see how church can be that sort of root that forms the community grows around. So like it's one of those roots that maybe a school is, church is, your Kiwanis Club, your sports league, and they all provide sort of the roots that allows the community tree to flourish.
Well, and you know, in my channel, I talk a fair amount about principalities and what happens when, you know, so one of my illustrations of what do I mean by spirit, think about school spirit. What is, because I use school spirit because most people have some experience of that, maybe your high school or your college, usually a high school, because at that point the students have reached a developmental level that they can actually participate in school spirit. And so you ask yourself, well, where does school spirit come from? Well, obviously the principal has something to do with it. The architecture of the building has something to do with it. Where the building sits in the city or the country has something to do with it. The leaders within the student body have something to do with it. In fact, past leaders of classes that schools are interesting because usually you have about a 4-year cycle, let's say a high school, 9 through 12. And so, you know, 5 years, at least among the students, the memory is mostly obliterated. You might have had brothers or sisters in it. And you think about what goes into school spirit. And you think about the fact that school spirit can be a positive or a negative thing. And in fact, but it is something that can send people out their whole life. And okay, so what is it? And what are the contributing factors? I mean, it's something that is something this small that all of us have experienced, is so large and so powerful potentially, yet we can't, if we sat down to try to list everything that contributed to the school spirit of the high school you went to, you'd spend all day, and you couldn't exhaust that list in a day. And that's, you know, putting some work into it.
A micro-nationalism of a kind.
Right. And that's just a school. Talk about a family which is multi-generational. I mean, an alcoholic 2 generations back will have impacts in the present generation. Now talk about a religious community where you have a figure, let's say like Jesus, who had a particular body of teaching, and then that religious community has its own history. All this stuff is built into us in ways that we simply don't know, because we are these massive cultural absorbers. I ask people, let's say you get married. You don't start with a blank piece of paper in your marriage. The first draft of your marriage was your parents' marriage. And there are echoes of all the other relationships back over that, divorces, second marriages, you know, I mean, all of this stuff is built up into a human being and built up into every manifestation of human community. The complexity of what we're talking about now is simply, we don't have enough time in our life to even notate the complexity of what goes into us. And first of all, it's amazing we function at all. That is a flat out miracle once you begin to see all of the layers. And then to realize that, well, we're in a phase right now where institutions are breaking down. We've seen those phases before. And there are lots of different size cycles too. There's like a 100-year cycle, then there's a 500-year cycle, and a 2,000-year cycle. And all of those cycles are manifest inside each other. Some institutions right now are buzzing up, and they're going to be with us for a couple of centuries. Others that have been with us for a while are breaking down. We see this in governments all the time. History is the record of it. So there's a lot going on, and it's rational that we feel ourselves powerless. Yet, again, back to the example of school spirit. One person in one class 30 years ago might have had such an impact in school spirit by doing something. Maybe that person, when everybody was mocking the fat kid or the kid with zits or the kid who couldn't play sports, that high status person bent down and befriended that, and that changed school spirit for 30 years. These things happen. And so a lot of it has to do, again, with salience and attention. And and I think you're exactly right about Jordan Peterson. I mean, by giving vision, he brought agency into people's lives. And I mean, just look at the impact that we don't know yet, the impact Jordan Peterson will have, but I've watched it. And I think, I've tried in some ways to magnify it, because I saw this as a positive thing in people's lives. And so I said, how can I magnify it? Well, I'll start a meetup. I'll start a YouTube channel. Where this goes, I won't live long enough to see. I'm not smart enough to know. So it's an amazing thing we're participating in here.
And I think that this Peterson sort of awakening vision and giving agency, that's actually the thing that pissed everybody off about him. Because people don't want, especially the people who think that we need to fix systems and that the institution needs to be reformed, they really did not like him. And I think that, because I don't want to speak too badly about anyone, but they've given themselves over to this ideology. They've given themselves over to these institutional ways, systemic ways of thinking. And if someone's coming along and saying, no, you've got power, that's hard to hear.
So to go back to the Arendt a little bit, because that's also the name of our podcast. Yeah. I don't know if you've ever heard of him before, Paul. My brother, professor at Bard, Roger Berkowitz, who he runs the Hannah Arendt Center. He founded it, and I took a class with him about the origins of totalitarianism. And one of the first things he said to the class was, "Do you feel powerful?" He asked the students and singled out a few people individually to give an answer. And most people said, "Oh no, I'm not powerful at all. I'm just one person." Especially if someone says, "Oh, I'm a woman. I don't have very much power whatsoever." And Arendt goes into this idea, and she talks about the wheel of history and how at a certain point the masses saw themselves as being powerless masses caught up in the wheel of history. And so they shouldn't really act. They should more just kind of go along with things. And she has this bit about Lawrence of Arabia and how, despite his clear and obvious power and influence and vast ability to change the course of human events, he still saw himself as caught up in the wheel of history. And I see the woke left sort of grouping of people, despite the gains they make, they literally got the mayor of New York City to paint Black Lives Matter outside of Donald Trump's building, and they still see themselves as powerless. And they don't understand the vast degree of power. In several short months, they've gotten most major corporations around the world to bend a knee to them. They've gotten world leaders. They've inspired movements around the entire world in countries that don't have very many Black people, or don't have police brutality problems. This ideology has been incredibly influential. And like we said earlier, power is in some way sense the ability to influence others and get them to act. If the woke left in America says stand up and raise your fist, or kneel down and raise your fist, and people in Poland and New Zealand do it, they have quite a bit of power. And when people have this power and don't recognize it, I think that is a very dangerous thing. And that's why Arendt talks about this, because these people then become just caught up in the wave of whatever happens. And she's very critical of movements, because movements, along with ideology, they have to keep moving. They have to go somewhere. So if you're caught up in a movement like this and you feel powerless, you're just going to keep, trying, you're never going to actually recognize what's going on. It's like painting the wall red and you don't even see that you've actually finished painting the wall. So you're going to get a brighter red, maybe even some blood.
No, that's really good. That's really interesting. I hadn't really thought of the relationship between movements and having to keep moving, but it's a really clever.
It's almost simplistic at first, yeah. But when you think about it, it's like I read something in my 10th grade. We had a sociology, no, it was 12th grade sociology class. It was nonsense elective. You basically read several definitions from sociology. The teacher was a ardent far right kind of just blowhard who would just he copied a graphic from Fox News one time. I recognized it in class. Interesting class, but I'm bringing it up because in our sociology textbook, it mentions something about the March of Dimes and how the March of Dimes is an example of a bureaucracy, because once, I think it was polio was originally about, once polio stopped being a problem, they moved on to the next thing and stayed in existence. If you apply that to something like a feminist movement or an anti-racism movement, they're a movement. So once they meet their goal, they're not likely to just disband and say, okay, we're done. They're going to look for the next place to go. And I think that hearing that, I think it was most likely Berkowitz who explained it to me in that way, really helped me see the kind of fallacy in taking up a cause in this way.
And it kind of goes back to the whole handing out human rights degrees issue.
Yeah,
it'd be really interesting to see what Hannah Arendt thought about that.
Well, and there's a long history of this. I've been working my way through, I like these great courses series on Audible, and I'm doing one in American religious history. The women's temperance movement was a deeply impactful movement in the 19th, early 20th century. Prohibition passed. You know how difficult it is to pass a constitutional amendment in the United States?
When's the last time an important one? What's the last consequential amendment since that?
Yeah,
the voting age, a small difference in when you can vote. That's probably the most influential change to the Constitution, realistically, that's happened recently.
But the women's temperance movement was, an incredible movement, and it spawned many other movements as well. Even though today temperance sounds laughable, what prohibition actually did was the amount of drinking in America after prohibition was significantly less than it was before. Even though prohibition is considered to have been a failure and a disastrous public policy, the women's temperance, but you can still find temperance halls in certain little niches in America. But the temperance movement was in some ways set up by the Second Great Awakening. And history is like that. And, the current woke thing is obviously an heir of Occupy. But in many ways, it seems to me that, I've long appreciated the study of the civil rights movement. Dr. King rose to prominence because they were addressing the situation on the buses of Montgomery, Alabama, and they had a specific goal. And so much of what I've seen by this current movement is, okay, we're going to strike to end racism. Okay. But racism is something that will never end. Okay. Can you be a little more specific here? That would really help us all, because, I remember when Colin Kaepernick bent a knee, and I thought, I'm going to bend a knee until, police stop killing black people. And I thought, you're never going to get off the stadium floor here,
buddy. Do you have
buddy.
a philosopher's stone or something? Because it's going to take quite a while.
Yeah. And so I think part of what a lot of effective people who changed the country in effective ways was, well, be specific. What exactly would you like changed? Let's talk about that. Let's debate that. But I'm going to, and let's just go all the way.
Well, have you seen the list of demands they come out with sometimes? They're ridiculous.
Oh, yeah.
Eventually they do produce some specifics, and what I've seen a lot of times is vague things about how to finance things without how to pay for them. And then somewhere at the end, it will say free Palestine.
Right.
And it just, I don't, like they include some wacky other thing, and it just turns into like a manifesto rather than an actual specific demand.
I was going through Dr. King's biography sometime in January.
Which one?
The autobiography, actually.
Oh.
It's edited by someone who collected all of his works together. I'm forgetting his name. And I was astounded about, they were very specific, and they spent 1 year on a bus boycott in one town. It's a very different approach than what people are asking for now.
And they were trained activists. They did, like the sessions
they went through
where
rigorous
they would be
training.
yelled at, spit at, and you're talking about people who crumple in the slightest bit of wind. If they think they hear the word, the R word, that's enough to send them into a week-long spiral. And the movement that seemed to have worked was some of the toughest, smartest people around. I don't think these are some of the toughest, smartest people around.
Dr. King also, in his diagnosis of the problem I think he picked up on this power issue. He said that he uses the word Negro just as a disclaimer, I guess, but he says the American Negro is suffering from a problem. They're suffering from a feeling of nobodiness, and what we need to inculcate is a feeling of somebodyness. And it seems again to be this this project of imbuing people with more agency.
No, I think it's helpful.
Yeah.
And then Dr. Peterson, clean your room, start somewhere, do something.
Right.
And like, part of my critique of Peterson was, there's a lot of people doing things. And I think you're right in that this wokeism is sort of, it's become it takes on the characteristics of religion and affords what religion does. And that's sort of what has happened with politics, that politics has become the religion of people. Whereas I think religion is something deeper. I often say, well, religion is always and politics is now. Now and always have a very interesting relationship, because you're always living in the now, but you're always living in the always. But you try to get a sense of you need a vision of the good. Well, you're not gonna, you might attempt to manifest that vision of the good through politics. That is what politics is for. But the politics will not give you a vision of the good. Politics should give you a vision of the can.
So this is one of the issues with the wokeism, is people starting at politics, trying to work backwards to religion, rather than starting at religion and moving forward into politics.
Right.
I think I would disagree with you guys a little bit on that.
Well, I'd like to hear it.
Yeah, just I'm not upset at you guys or anything. Just I look at it more as politics is kind of a space for generating new ideas between people, and it's a fairly Arendtian kind of view of things, and that politics is a sort of sphere, a public sphere, in which you get together and hopefully the newness and some sort of novel idea comes through the sharing of your own reflections with other people. And so especially I look at things in a more secular way, there is almost, you don't have to be, I'm not saying that you have to do it secularly, but in a secular sense, it would kind of be just like, I don't know what the proper term is, but it'd almost be like a idea generating, like a forum type thing. And from there, I don't know that I would agree that you need some sort of religious basis, and you could almost replace it maybe with a discussion of where we're going as a community, kind of.
Arendt's religion is Socrates and the ancient Greeks and Romans. Like it's not religion it's not a deistic religion, but her where she gets her vision of the good comes from people like Socrates or maybe Virgil, Plato.
In early America too. She had really admired the coffee houses. It's like certain periods in world history where she thought there was open exchange of ideas.
Yeah, she's not trying to construct a vision of the good from scratch, and work that way. She does still go into the past to find, like she still grounds it in philosophy, right? It's not just politics all the way up.
It's not disconnected from the rest of the world or anything like that.
Right.
So Ethan, how do you define religion?
Well, so that's a good question, because I took some religious studies class with Raj at Bard, and we learned about how religion is a fairly new term, and correct me where I'm wrong, but I think it means to repeat over and over again.
That's one of the Latin roots. Yeah. Yeah.
And so what was the year, Raj, where people started to refer to sort of a drank too much coffee. Yeah, concretized. I drank too much coffee. I'm getting a little jittery. You might see me moving around a little. But it's sort of the idea that you have a worldview versus religion, I think, kind of changed in history. So before, people never said, "Oh, I have a religion," if I remember Chilton's class correctly. And so when I use the term religion, I'm kind of using it to mean both that sort of like how you view the world and also the process of going to church, praying, but also in the sense of like an Umwelt, almost like a Weltanschauung, worldview, the way that you look at the world. And so to me, from a religious perspective, is kind of basing it upon what your conception of God is, and that's the fundamental basic working. And so if when I say like a religious sense, I mean connected to a sort of belief in God and a way that you go about acting on that belief. If that makes sense?
Do you know the story of Agamemnon sacrificing his daughter for fair winds from Artemis? That's in.
Sounds vaguely in Greek mythology.
That's in the Iliad, where our Agamemnon, of course, Menelaus, his wife Helen, stole away to Troy. And Agamemnon wants to go with Menelaus and get his
He capture the wind.
So, well, Artemis has a little beef with Agamemnon because he killed one of her sacred deer. And so he needs the proper winds to get to Troy. And in order to do that, he sacrifices his daughter, which his wife takes issue with. But the question of religion goes into, was that a religious act of Agamemnon sacrificing his daughter? Because part of, you might be interested in an English historian named Tom Holland, who's been working on a bunch of these issues, because he made the same observation. He said, it's true of the Bible as well. You can only find the word religion in English translations like 2 or 3 times in the Bible, and you'd think, for a religious book, you'd think they'd use the word. And so the question, I think, of religion is, what is the most basic level of what the world is for and how it works? That, I think, is the religious layer. I see politics more as the layer of how can we approach those more foundational values in the now? How can we realize them in our present community? And I use that framework sometimes, as opposed to the idea that religious is what people do when they go to church, because you're quite right, that's a fairly new idea, and it's sort of an idea which it grows out of the American experience. 9 out of the 13 original colonies had state churches, and it's only the federal level that was secular, partly pragmatically because you weren't going to get the New England Puritans to necessarily agree with some of the Southern Anglicans. So, I think when we're talking about ultimate values, what is good, that's how I'm using the term religious here. And we're very much worldview in a sense. And politics is more the practicality of what kind of policy do we need, what kind of institutions do we need to accomplish that which we say as good.
I think the act of deciding and coming together to have a common good is a political act. I would see that as politics. So yes. You have a forum and you say, we need to fix this problem, but first, like, let's say the local pool is defunct and it needs to be fixed. And some people don't want to fix it, some people do. You kind of have to decide, if you're going to fix it, that one of our common goods is investing in the community or community resources. And I do see there's a kind of, like what Arendt would say, is a private sphere where that was where those kind of private conversations happen, where you think with one in yourself, you're thinking, reflecting yourself on what is good, or maybe talking to your wife, or maybe, I don't know if the church would count as public or private necessarily, but talking to people in your congregation, etc. I think there is some sort of space that's non-political where these conversations maybe start, but some sense of agreeing on a common good, I think, needs to be, or just is, political, because people are talking with each other in a sort of public way to decide on where to go, or why they want to go.
I don't know that people think good is a function. People pursue the good with politics, but they know the good with religion.
So this was, Raj, you remember we talked about this. I would not be able to tell you where it is in the Bible. Hopefully one of you guys know. Maybe it was in Names. I think the quotation is, "The will of God is written on the heart of all men." Are you familiar with that quote? I hope I'm not misquoting that. I hope that's correct. Raj, do you remember talking about this before?
That's not ringing a bell.
If
But
only we
the
had
idea,
a magic machine to plug words into and see where
I'm-
they came from.
yeah, I'm Googling it right now. On the heart of all men, and the idea is kind of people are born with some sort of knowledge of morality. But I think that in a certain sense, in a pluralistic community, you might have to discard that. I don't know if I'm making too much sense, but the idea that there is like you could factually say this is good versus not good. I think
Well, I think that's a riff on Jeremiah 31.
I found something from, let's see, New Living Translation of Romans 2:15. They demonstrate that God's law is written in their hearts.
Yes.
It might have, I think you're right, it might have been some sort of quotation of a quotation or some sort of version of whatever. But if you catch my drift in the idea that people know, do people know intrinsically what's good, and it's just a matter of listening to your conscience, or is there a process by which we need to rationally or logically figure out what good is?
So I think the Sikh answer to that question is that God is inside of you, right? Like God is resides within each individual, but then you have to tear away this veil of Maya. You have to get in touch with Sach. You have to get in touch with truth, and you do that through meditating on the scripture, meditating on truth early in the morning. There's an emphasis on doing it early in the morning for some reason. And there's like, you're supposed to spend this time. There is an aspect of this reflection that Arendt is talking about too, in that. At least in the Sikh conception, God is ever existent. God creates the world, and he creates the world with the name, the Nam, his name, and then through the name he enters into creation. And then what the guru keeps trying to do is telling you how to recognize the name, how to realize that you're living in the name. And they do that with Bani, or Shabad, which is the word. So there's these kind of like weird little parallels between what's going on over in the Bible with the use of the word and the logos and stuff like that. But these all have different etymological origins. But there is something about, like in it, like Plato, right? Plato says everything is remembering. All knowledge is remembering. That you knew what was, you knew, but then when you come into this world, there's this process of, because it has to do with what, like mathematics being like this abstraction that like you can figure out mathematics intuitively to a certain degree. So the idea that people can recognize what the good is, I think, if they're oriented properly. But then the question is, how do you orient? But yeah, Paul?
It's a complicated question in terms of the Bible, because Jeremiah 31 is a prophecy that God will, the world will be full of the knowledge of God as the waters cover the sea. That's not an unusual metaphor in the Bible. Romans 1 talks about the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. In other words, we are motivated to suppress the truth because we want to do some things. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature has been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and foolish, and their foolish hearts were darkened. And so there's a lot of complexity in this knowing the good. Um, and in the midst of human life, it's often very difficult to know the good. So if there's a homeless person asleep on the sidewalk here, what is the good? Is the good to rouse them because this is not a good place to live? Is the good to give them $20? Is the good to put them in my car and take them to a shelter? Is the good to take them to my home? Is the good to open a, I mean, it's again, with humanity, things get very complicated very fast. But I guess just in terms of nomenclature, I try to, churches are highly political organizations because churches have, in a sense, a certain degree of commonality with respect to the good. They even have a book they have in common. They have all of this stuff. Yet, before I got here, one of the biggest fights this church ever had was, do they put blue carpeting on the stage or red? And that became this massive fight, blue or red. And then, certain people who give certain amount of money and other people, and color and socioeconomic class, and did they grow up within the denomination or did they come in later? I mean, church, there's no politics like church politics because it's so close to the good. And I think that's part of why I think secularization has heightened a lot of these tensions in our culture, because Miroslav Volf, who was a young man in the breakup of communist Yugoslavia, wrote about how for former communists who believed that this world was all there is, well, you've got a little window to derive for yourself all the blessings and all the beneficial experience you will ever get. And hey, baby, the clock is ticking. You're only going to be 20s in your 20s for so long, and then in your 30s and 40s. And what life is massive potential via the clock, running out of time. Well, people tend to get more and more violent and desperate as things run out, because it's up to me to secure it now. At least with religious people who have a belief in an afterlife, well, I can sacrifice here because, there will be payback in the life to come. If you don't believe that, well, now suddenly you have a zero-sum game where it's my good life or it's your good life. I choose me.
Right. This is something you brought up, I think, in your conversation with the folks over at Unsafe Space.
Yep.
That the woke left, they are really preoccupied with the notion of justice, but they're trying to get perfect justice in this world. And it's
right.
like, I don't know if that's possible, guys. And you're probably going to turn into Antifa pretty quick if what you're trying to secure is perfect justice.
That's right. Because
oh no, go ahead.
What do we want it? What do we want? Justice. When do we want it? Now. One person in a comment said, when I see someone who wants it now, I run away, because now is a pretty small window.
Right.
I think that's an interesting concept of that somehow religion ameliorates personal desires. Is that what you're saying in
Yes.
favor of some grander afterlife? I'm not really I don't know too much about the specifics of demographics in Soviet or communist China, but as far as I remember reading, people were still largely religious. It was mostly the state silenced them from expressing religious tendencies. I think maybe later generations were born within communism that tended to change. But in my experience with religious versus non-religious people, I think I've almost seen the opposite a lot of times, where this religious, well, maybe not use the term religion, this faith that they have, their faith gives them a sort of personal righteousness. And especially if you think about something like the doctrine of wealth or like extreme Calvinism, if you're doing well in life, you think, oh, God's on my side, he's for me, and then you might be more inclined in some senses to then prey upon your workers and say, look, God put them in the position of the workers. I'm the boss. I deserve to be able to take advantage of them a little, make a little bit more money, pay them less maybe. I'm not saying anything negative about religious people necessarily. Just that I've seen that in non-religious people too. You know, if there's no dagger over their head, some people will just run wild in the streets and do whatever because they don't see any consequences. But I have seen the opposite, where I think people who are fairly faithful or have some sort of strong faith, they use it to explain or can't think of the term I'm looking. They basically use it as a crutch, so to get away with things that they know deep down aren't correct.
I've seen human beings have a tremendous capacity to justify what they want to do. I'll say that. Being a Calvinist minister, I've never seen a lot of these things often attributed to Calvinism that I often hear. I know mostly Calvinists. I know more percentage-wise. I know more Calvinists than most people. I do find that human beings will, when human beings find something they want, they will find ways to justify and get it. That is really human, and religion is a part of that. Religious excuses, and I'll tell you, there are no games like religious games, and if you could see them played out in church.
There's a
I didn't mean to pick on Calvinism specifically, just as an example of like any sort of like you're saying, if people want something, if they want wealth, they're then going to their political ideology, their faith is going to justify their quest for wealth. So maybe it's not specific to faith at all.
There is a paper that I had to read in grad school about it was investigating empirically whether religion causes violence, which is something that people like Dawkins and Sam Harris like to claim, that religion is the cause of violence. And this empirical study, I'm forgetting who wrote it. I'll try and track it down, maybe post it in our show notes, and said that it's not obvious that religion causes violence. More likely what is happening is that there is a clash of multiple identity groups, and religion is used as a justification to assert power of one identity over the other identity. And it's like religion is a very powerful tool for motivating people, because I think evolutionarily we are built for religion. And so it's a very you can activate and wake people up using the tool of religion, or using religious like speech, rituals, using incantations. All those sorts of things are very powerful things that awaken people to act. But to say that it's to say that the fault lies in the religious system itself rather than maybe how a person is yielding it, I think those are two very different claims, and they don't necessarily, I don't think that bears out in the facts.
The tools that religions have offered the world are some of the most powerful tools for colonizing human beings ever known. How do we know that? Because they've endured, because they're still here. All the bad tools, in terms of tools that are least effective, I break it down basically like this. The world is far too complex for any of us to manage. One of the earliest ways that we learn to manage the complexity of the world is via narrative. And in fact, we manage our lives via narrative. We manage our identity via narrative. We manage our community via narrative. Narrative is the most powerful. It's one of the most powerful human complexity management tools we have. Religions are in many ways just enormously powerful, successful narratives that human beings have used not only to manage the complexity internally, but manage the community externally for us to actually accomplish something. Now, the political narratives as well, but the religious narratives are far older and far more enduring, because governments come and go, but religions, Sikhism, Christianity's 2000, Judaism, older than that, Hinduism. Religions are the narratives that have endured longer than any other narrative on the human shelf. Political narratives, they're relative newcomers.
Right.
Also, based on immediacy a lot of times too. Like if there's a war coming, your political ideology is going to be more bellicose, etc. But if your mission of religion is more to understand the world or prescribe how people should act, that is going to have just a more enduring quality. And like the political ideologies that have endured are mostly, I think, more vague, like liberalism, communism. It's not giving you necessarily the specific, there's no necessarily 10 commandments. It's more of a, here's a general way we should organize our society.
Yep.
So though no, it is gotten to be quite a long conversation, so we might want to think about wrapping up. I'm having a great time, but I don't know how many people want to listen to us for over 2 hours.
But I would be surprised.
You never know. But I think that we could talk about, I don't know if you had fun, Paul, but I'd definitely be down to maybe switch tracks and talk again about something else or take a deeper dive into something specific, because this is pretty illuminating for me.
Yeah, we could do it again, I'm sure. I do this all the time. It's enjoyable.
Nice.
Too bad you don't live in Sacramento. I was thinking now that governor's saying we can do stuff outside, I'm thinking of getting the meetup back together. So
yeah, I'm definitely planning on visiting California at some point. It's possible to plan anything right now with this epidemic going on, but I'll be over there eventually. And
I'll definitely bring them to a meetup if it's happening.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. I was reading about somebody else that you guys might know his name. Someone else had been doing Jordan Peterson meetups somewhere in California, and it appeared that it folded pretty quickly. So I was surprised to hear that there was still like a continuing thing going on, because I haven't really heard too much about him recently. I was never really terribly enamored with him. I thought he's interesting, and he kind of had a good outlook on telling people to kind of, buck up, put on your big boy pants. But I wasn't particularly taken with his larger ideology, but it is interesting to see that that has inspired such a long series of meetups.
Oh yeah, that's there's a Discord server, Bridges of Meaning, that was sort of spun out from our local meetup, and I don't know how many Jordan Peterson meetups are going on anymore. My group wanted to rename it Jordan Peterson Style Meetups because we don't actually talk about him much, but Jordan became a way for people to find each other who were sort of interested in similar conversations. And I think, someone had told David Fuller, he's one of the founders of Rebel Wisdom out of the UK. He had said that, with the IDW is not necessarily the content on the hard drives, it's the internet protocol between them. And so in some ways, the IDW space is, I think, a conversational culture by which we have an opportunity to share ideas.
The notion of
go ahead, Rush.
I was just going to say that the notion of the great conversation that has spanned over the Western canon, it's actually finally turning into a living conversation on the internet and YouTube space and stuff like that. It's a really fascinating shift to watch.
I was looking at it more in terms of like a Carl Schmitt thing, where what is his quote? Politics is about differentiating friends from enemies. When I look at the intellectual dark web, I kind of see people as a shared enemy, and that's, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but there's this specter of danger in society that's getting people to band together. And that was kind of why I was interested in this podcast, is kind of being one of the little thought bubbles amongst the various people talking and trying to get more of a community built between these like small networks. So like there's X podcast group where we all get together and talk, and then we talk to the other podcast group and have cross conversations. So I've had so many people who are like, you start talking about being critical of any sort of popular reductive narrative that people aren't fond of, and they're like, oh my god, it feels so good to be able to talk about this. There's like a sense of relief. Like, no, I don't know anyone who enjoys saying Latin X unless it's some sort of performative action to get their other woke friends to pat them on the back. But when you finally say like, I think that's bullshit, people kind of, oh, okay, I think it's bullshit too, thanks. I think that I hadn't, can't remember it. The coffee's getting to my brain again, but something about like deep breath or something, like sometimes that concept of not orienting around a specific idea or person, but kind of like taking a deep breath,
Sigh of
being
relief.
able to, almost like a confessional, I think. Like, I think it does take on a kind of confessional quality in these sort of meetup conversations where you're like, I believe this to be true. And it's not about necessarily being judged, but sort of confessional, absent of any judgment or punishment.
Yeah.
And
That's
it's
been my experience.
Do you mind if I say two things? Then
you can say one thing, Ron.
say.
No, go ahead. You can say.
Well, I wanted to actually do
Three
a plug.
if you really want to.
I wanted to do a plug for our next episode, but I don't know if that would be uncouth. But we're actually going to be talking to Benjamin Boyce next week.
Oh, good.
Yeah. And then I had this, Ethan and I, we spent a lot of time thinking about RN, and I've got this one quote that I kind of want to run by you that it just keeps sticking with me. It keeps popping up in my mind every time we talk about woke ideology. Every generation, civilization is invaded by barbarians. We call them children. It seems to be we have a lot of kids running around. And I know Ethan and I aren't that old, but
That's a great quote, because it's every, now I'm in my 50s now, and I have 5 children, and children are formed by their worlds. But as I said earlier, worlds are enormous. The world is enormously complex thing. So you have 5 children, you begin to realize they're all different. Every single one of those 5 children I had was different. They have the same 2 parents, same 2, biological, genetic pools, but different things, and where they are in the birth order, their unique experiences, but they all have to sort of be socialized into the conversation. And then there are, knowing that with 0 to 6, there's one segment, like 6 to 12, and then 12 to 20, and now they're all in their 20s, and I'm watching them go through their stuff, and now more and more in contact with the world. I mean, we are enormously blessed. We live in a wonderful age in many respects. We have these tools. I mean, we're talking video conferencing across the country right now. We're going to post it, and other people are going to listen to our conversation. And gosh, we live in amazing times. And I don't think, one of the things that Jordan Peterson often talked about, which I think was exactly right, a little bit of gratitude and a little bit of humility would serve us well, because compared to much of what has happened in human history, wow, do we have it good. And that goodness was purchased by the sacrifices of previous generations. And then at some point ask ourselves, what are we leaving to succeeding generations? Important questions.
I was in Nicaragua for 3 months in 2014, I think. And that every day was a visceral reminder of how goddamn lucky I am to live in America and to have been born in America in this time period. Yeah. And I literally every second I mean, it's a great place, not disparaging the country at all, or the people especially, but you're constantly reminded of how lucky you are to have glass in your windows. There aren't poisonous snakes, that the dogs don't have rabies. You don't have dogs chasing around in the street. You can drink whatever water you get out of a tap in most places in America. We have Flint and whatever, but it's really, I think that's a really important thing to recognize. And especially grew up in Troy, New York. It's not a very wealthy place. And then I went to Bard College, and it was filled with these resentful ingrates who couldn't appreciate the fact that they're in the safest, one of the most beautiful places in the whole world. And it was just like that's part of the reason I went to Nicaragua, because I was like, I want to go. My ex-girlfriend had family there, so we had like a trip planned. I want to go experience the world and see, are they telling the truth? Is Bard actually the worst place in America? Are we really oppressed? Or is it actually quite the opposite? And it appeared to me to be quite the opposite. And me and Raj have a friend who's a Tibetan refugee. And so he had his own take, which is very similar, which is like, fucking lucky to be here. It's awesome. It's amazing to be in America and going to this college, and, no one's shooting me if I take the wrong turn, etc. Yeah.
All right.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I have a copy of it, and I don't know if you guys, you know,
you guys were recording this?
I've got a copy too.
So you're going to post it on Friday, or you're going to want to edit it? But just let me know. I mean, and you can decide when you'd like me to post it, and just that it fits into my posting schedule too. And
okay. When's the soonest you would probably post it?
I could post it tomorrow. I mean,
Okay.
I don't edit. So.
We can, there's no real reason to edit any of this, but we can, we'll post it tomorrow as well. We've got a backup episode that we recorded a couple of weeks ago. We'll release that on Friday.
Okay. Well, send me the links that you'd like me to include. If you got Twitter handles or any personal information you'd like me to include in the notes, and I'll put it in the notes. Okay?
Sounds good. Thank you,
Good.
Paul.
Great, guys. Great
Thanks,
conversation. Bye-bye.
The radio and television to tell the show. I saw the alien, okay. I saw the peace sign, November break of day. I saw the alien, okay. Shining in the sky, November break of day. Endeavor, the happiest rabbit ever, within the cosmic blessing of love and energy. Drums to space, you know this is the place. Our heart and soul has saved the human race. Could it be that we truly know the score? 'Cause my alien friends say we ended the war. A bloody battle, fight. Somehow we did it. Victory of the light. But I won't break the arcade game before the flash that makes the black heart taste a lash. I won't disclose the future except for what I know, till the radio and television do tell the show. I saw the alien, okay. I saw the peace sign, remember break of day. I saw the alien, okay. Shining in the sky, November break of day. the peace sign in November break of day. I saw the alien, okay, shining in the sky in November break of day. I saw the alien, okay, I saw the peace sign too, okay. I saw the alien, okay, shining in the sky in November break of day.